Ladies and gentlemen, I am Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It is October 15th, 2022. This is your daily Ukraine update, and we are going to be asking ourselves, are the Russians returning to the offensive? Let's get into it. Okay, so when we look at the tactical map, we can see that there are a number of changes. First off, in the north, you can see that Russians have been pushed back from this Kaislavika, and while again, we've talked about the fact that control of these major roadways is very significant in this conflict because it's such a logistics-heavy conflict. And as we've also talked about, being able to create salience in lines, whether Russian or Ukrainian, are naturally kind of liabilities for the side that is making the salient. So we've got to see if Ukraine can sustain this into a larger advance, because right now, any forces in this region are going to be surrounded by Russians on three sides. But as we've talked about, this is sort of the challenge of this conflict more generally, is to create these situations where your enemy is at risk of being encircled and has to withdraw. It's not very complicated. It's not very complicated to describe, but very complicated to execute. Here we can see that the Russians are subject to the same sort of salient at Volodymyrivka. When we look to the south, you can see that this is actually a fairly interesting change, right? Ukrainian forces had pushed and seized Spirne, and you could see Russian forces have pushed back and attempted to secure Spirne. This sort of back and forth is probably a function of, again, the fact that Ukrainian forces pushed out and may have ended up exposed on kind of these roadways and open areas, and were then pushed back, keeping Spirne contested. As we've talked about, it would be significant for the Ukrainians if they can break Russian lines and begin the process of encircling Lysychansk, a sort of reverse of what happened several months ago when Russian forces encircled the Ukrainians and forced their withdrawal from Lysychansk. Now, I want to point out that some of these are very minor changes to the salience and the line of contact, and they could be what's described as probing attacks. This is the idea that you're testing the enemy's defensive posture. You're actually learning about how they respond to attacks by actually staging your own attacks where you have no intention of exploiting the attack into anything larger, where you're just sort of seeing, okay, how do the Russians respond if we push into Spirne? You watch as they allocate forces. Maybe you're trying to assess what firepower they have on the line, and you're gaining intelligence about the enemy's disposition and composition by forcing them to go on the offensive. When we look to the south, right, we know that the Bakhmut area, we are reasonably certain that the Bakhmut area is the site of the Wagner Group, and this is where, of course, Berezkin, so-called Putin's chef, is really trying to distinguish his forces as one of the most combat-effective forces in this conflict. But you can see that this isn't while there's changes, it's tough to characterize it as progress. They experience some level of loss in the south and some level of gain a bit to the north, none of which are really pushing them towards their actual operational objective of Bakhmut. And in the areas closest to this town, there's no movement at all in the lines. So probably not exactly a sterling victory for Berezkin and the Wagner Group, more like shuffling around the troops and positions of your front line. Finally, to the very furthest south, you can see Pisky has had the same basic effect. It appears that there's some sort of maybe offensive or repositioning of forces, right? They pull back from this salient here and instead sort of broadly try to occupy positions. This would be notable because it is the first time, though, we've seen Russian forces actually control the airport. Maybe they are actually listening to me. Terrifying. But as discussed, if you're resorting to getting advice from a YouTube personality, It's a sign that the war is not going great for you. But they have secured this airport. Of course, just because you've secured the airport doesn't mean you're going to bring aircraft to land. You've got to get enough of a radius here to ensure that enemy anti-air defenses and enemy artillery aren't going to be raining down on your planes as you bring them into the airport. When we look over at the news, we can see that it sounds like Putin is going to have to, this is an interesting turn of phrase, make a virtue of necessity. This means that he's going to frame that his partial mobilization will end in 2 weeks. He's going to claim that it has successfully achieved its objective because all along the plan was to use these mobilized troops to buy time to run the Russian government's standard conscription cycle. Putin's probably going to conscript about 120,000 men for this autumn cycle. And what's interesting is that, of course, even Russia is acknowledging now of the 220,000 people who were mobilized, 35,000 are already in Russian military units and 16,000 are in units involved in combat missions. He said these forces allegedly received 5 to 10 days, 5, of initial training, 5 to 15 days of training with combat units, also 5, and then directly taking part in hostilities. 10 days of training before taking part in hostilities is a frighteningly small amount of training. However, they point out that these 10 days of training may not look exactly like we would expect in a Western country like the U.S. military. Some of these units appear to have just wandered around training grounds with no commanding officers, food, or shelter for several days before being shipped to Ukraine. I guess surviving in the absence of command, control, or logistics is actually probably outstanding combat training for Russian troops in this conflict. But basically, they are going to hope that the formal Russian conscript cycle will be able to show up to the front lines trained and ready, having gone through the regular Russian military conscription training process. That said, of course, the conscription training process requires trainers. And it sounds like Russia, by all accounts, drained its training units months ago. Anyway, guys, that is all I had for you for today. Thank you so much for joining me. Of course, if you want access to the uncensored combat video breakdowns, the kind that YouTube is getting increasingly censorious about letting me show, you want to become a member of the Patreon. I'm on the road. I don't have my up-to-date Lieutenant tier patron list, but I appreciate you guys and everything you do to support the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next one.